Hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is going to be a new playlist dedicated to one of the better books I've ever read on the history of the Arab Afghans in Afghanistan, called "The Arabs at War in Afghanistan" by Leah Farrell and Mustafa Hamid. Now, Mustafa Hamid is going to be the central figure in this book. And a little bit of background: Mustafa Hamid, also known as Abu Walid al-Masri, had um, engaged in fighting when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. And he became part of a group known as the Afghan Arabs. During the 1980s, the United States provided material support to the Mujahideen, Afghans, and the Arabs who were resisting the Soviet invasion of the country, primarily through the CIA's Operation Cyclone. Mustafa Hamid had met very central figures during this conflict. Jalaluddin Haqqani, who would later form the Haqqani Network, he met him in 1979. He met Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the emir of the al-Jihad, also known as Egyptian Islamic Jihad, a fundamentalist sect in Cairo, Egypt, in 1986. And he also met Osama bin Laden in 1988 and was friends with him until his assassination on May 1st, 2011, by special forces. Al-Masri was actually a reporter during the conflict with El Ittihad News, and reportedly taught as a senior advisor at the Al Farouk training camp in the mid-1990s. After the Soviets left Afghanistan and when the Taliban emerged in control for much of the country, al-Masri was described as a leader or advisor to al-Qaeda based in Afghanistan, and by then became closely aligned with the leadership of the Al Farouk camp. Although he would later in the book disclaim this is attributed to him. He then moved with bin Laden to live with, he actually traveled to Sudan in 1996 and lived with bin Laden, and then together they returned back to Afghanistan. And he pledged allegiance or bayat to Mullah Omar, the leadership of the Taliban. So Mustafa Hamid is a very essential figure in this book. And during the chapter readings that we're going to be reading along together, usually I do chapter readings. I think that's boring. You should read along with me. So this way I could go over some things within the chapters as well, provide some additional commentary if needed. But you'll notice that there's initials MH in the book, and that's Mustafa Hamid speaking. And if it's not MH initialed, it's Leah Farrell telling the story. That's the primary author. And so this is chapter 1 of the book, which is entitled Arab-Afghan Jihad. Actually, the chapter is the Arab-Afghan Jihad, and the subtitle is Arab-Afghan Jihad. So without further ado. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up the communist regime that had seized power a year earlier and was battling an insurrection led by Afghan resistant groups whose leaders were in exile in Peshawar, Pakistan. The insurrection had not however, taken widespread hold among Afghan's population, most of whom remained on the sidelines of the conflict between these groups and the Kabul regime. The Soviet Union's invasion changed this dynamic, turning many Afghans from spectators of a limited insurrection into participants in a fully fledged armed struggle. Their taking up of arms to liberate the country from Soviet occupation marked the beginning of what is commonly referred to as the Afghan Jihad. Afghan fighters, Mujahideen, were soon joined by foreign volunteers who became known as the Arab Afghans. So these Arabs are coming from countries like Algeria, Iraq, Germany, France, the Philippines, Indonesia, and that they were called Arab Afghans. The Afghans were not called that. Okay. This name came not only to describe foreigners who fought during the jihad, but also those who remained in Afghanistan after Soviet withdrawal, or who traveled to the country after the Taliban's rise to power in the mid-1990s. And here's MH. This is Mustafa Hamid talking. I first heard the term Afghan Arabs used in 1989, although it is more commonly used now. Back then, the term Afghan Arab was meant derogatively as an insult to the Arabs, who were, in fact, in the minority. There were many more Arab foreign volunteers than there were Arabs participating in Afghanistan's jihad. Much of what is written about the Arab-Afghan rule and the jihad against the Soviet Union focuses on the later stages of the conflict, where foreign mujahideen were at the most numerous. But the history of the Arab Afghans at war in Afghanistan begins much earlier, particularly for the first generation mujahideen who traveled to the country between 1979 and 1984. Events taken place in the Arab world in the years leading up to the Soviet Union's December 1979 invasion played a significant role in motivating many earlier generation Arab Afghans to join the jihad in Afghanistan. There was a persuasive sense of anger within many Arab states, not only as at the corruption and brutal repression taking place at the hands of various regimes, but also at the perceived weakness of these regimes in the face of foreign political interference. Now, a little bit of background is that the Afghan leadership, like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, Abu Haraj al-Iraqi, and a lot of these other Afghan warlords, they were known to be very insular, didn't like working with outsiders. Afghans were basically notorious infighters of many trivial matters. They wanted to be leaders. They wanted to be the coffers of the most money, funding, and whatnot. They wanted to control the conflict. There was a lot of infighting. And so this actually deterred a lot of Arabs, nation states, governments to basically participate in the conflict itself, because these people were, very, they were not coordinating well within each other, which means that Arabs themselves, foreign fighters, would basically be seen as a nuisance almost. As a result, many came to believe that no real Arab state existed, let alone an Islamic one. Joining the conflict in Afghanistan offered those who felt this way an outlet for the frustrations and location to take action. Mustafa Hamid. The Arab world was quite simply on the boil. In addition to wanting to liberate Afghanistan, Arabs went to join the jihad because they felt stifled and frustrated at events in the Arab world and in their own countries, because Mustafa Hamid is right. Countries like Egypt, for example, or Syria, who were very repressive to the religious aspects of the Arab fundamentalist sects. Egypt, especially under Anwar Sadat, as well. But this is the problem that we're facing, is that these countries were mostly known as socialist countries, Arab socialists, which came under power under Gamal Abdel Nasser, the previous president to Anwar Sadat in Egypt, who began the repression of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood under Sayyid Qutb and Hassan al-Banna. But that extended into Syria, and that extended into Jordan, countries that basically had this socialist ideology that was permeating within society and universities in the 1950s and 60s. But a religious minority pushed back in the 1970s with the oil boom, and especially after 1979, which began the rise of fundamentalist Islam. In this way, Afghanistan became an outlet, and the regimes of many countries are happy to see these men leave for jihad, because they thought leaving would help reduce the political temperature in Rust. You know what Egypt did? After the assassination of Anwar Sadat, they arrested many hundreds of people from two religious fundamentalist groups called Egyptian Islamic Jihad and Gamma Islamiyah, which were Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri for the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and Omar Abdul Rahman, known as the Blind Sheikh, for the Gamma Islamiyah. These were two co-leaders of these groups. And what happened was a lot of these people were arrested, including these two. Well, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, Egypt basically says, would you like to go to jihad? You could be set free, but you cannot come back. And so what did they do? Of course, they didn't want to go to jail anymore. They didn't want to be in Egyptian and Syrian jails anymore because these people were getting tortured brutally. And they didn't forget this. And many of the people who survived this conflict came back and joined groups which basically tried to overthrow the Arab fundamentalist, the Arab socialist governments, which began a new ideology within Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, but it was created by Muhammad Abd al-Faraj al-Faraj, which was the basis of the near enemy and the far enemy approach. The near enemy meaning the overthrow of the Arab socialist regimes, and the far enemy meaning the West, the United States and Israel. The political temperature in Arab countries were also affected by the weaknesses many felt had beset Arabs after the defeat in the Arab-Israeli War in 1967, called the Six-Day War, which was basically an embarrassment for the Arab world. The capitulation of Arab states to Israel was seen as deeply humiliating and intensified the sense among some Arabs where their own countries had failed. And this is what led to the downfall of Arab socialism, Arab nationalism, as it's called. This was exacerbated by the crackdowns on those who participated in the earlier 1948 Palestine War, particularly the Egyptians. Mustafa Hamid. The defeat of 1967 shocked a generation of Arabs. Israel's siege of the Arab capital in Beirut in 1982, while other Arab countries looked the other way, in particular Egypt and Syria, had a huge impact. It caused a very big wound to the dignity of the Arab youth, who were left with a sense that there was no real Islamic states, only repressive regimes weak in the face of foreign interference. Many of them were angry. It was in this environment that the Afghan Jihad took people back to Islam and absorbed the negative feelings in the Arab countries because of this Islamic idea, and movement began to rise again. And so this is really important, because what this basically did was bring about a new invigoration of Arab fundamentalism with the defeat of the countries in Egypt and Jordan and Syria in the Six-Day War, with the repressive Arab nationalist regimes under Gamal Abdel Nasser and Hafiz Assad in Syria, as well as countries like Jordan and Afghanistan, basically were enjoying the Western socialist lifestyles. And then 1979 came place. There wasn't just the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. You also had the Iranian Revolution in 1980, which overthrew Rava Pahlavi, known as the Shah of Iran, who basically was a Western puppet for the last 20 years, in which the CIA overthrew, forcibly using the CIA, the Prime Minister of Iran, elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. You also had the Grand Mosque seizure in Saudi Arabia, which led a number of people like Muhammad al-Khattabi to believe he was the next Mahdi and the leader of the Arabs and the leader of the Saudis, to bring back Islam into the fold of the world, especially in Arab governments that basically was astray, in which he felt that the Saudi kingdom was becoming too westernized. This was followed up by Osama bin Laden, who was a very young man in King Fahd University, who basically saw the invasion as a resounding effect in his life. And so with all these events taking place, you could see that the motivations began to appear. And this was exacerbated during the Afghan war, as Mustafa Hamid succinctly offered here. While Afghanistan offered an outlet, those belonging to Islamic movements already existing in Arab countries, particularly those from Egypt and Syria. Syria also had the Muslim Brotherhood as well, were not significantly represented among early Arab-Afghan volunteers. These movements are groups such as Egypt's Tanim al-Jihad, which is al-Jihad, which also became Egyptian Islamic Jihad, the Gamma Islamiyah, and the Syrian Ikhwan Muslimin, which grew in the jails of the most home countries, as I explained before. Most members of these groups were either jailed or were still seeking to take action in their homelands against the regimes they saw as oppressive and illegitimate, rather than traveling to Afghanistan for jihad. And that's only because there were no services office. There was no recruitment offices in Afghanistan. This was later created by none other than Abdullah Azam. The idea came from Abdullah Azam, but it was funded by none other than Osama bin Laden. And it was called the Maktab al-Khidmat. And from the translation, it's the Afghan Services Bureau. It was only when their efforts had failed and they found themselves and their movements hunted and destroyed by the state that they began to seek refuge in Afghanistan in specific and significant numbers, with most arriving in the later period of the jihad between 1986 and 1992. So it's left Afghanistan in 1989 and thus became two civil wars that followed after that, which was worse than the 10-year war of the Soviet invasion. The first generation of Arabs arriving in Afghanistan between 1979 and 1984 were not generally part of these movements before they traveled to Afghanistan. Some did later join these movements when, after 1986, they began to establish a presence in Afghanistan. Despite lacking formal affiliations to armed groups in their homelands, many early generation Arab Afghans had military training or experience gained from military service in their home countries or from volunteering for jihad elsewhere. Some had a pedigree training back to the 1948 Palestinian War. Others had participated in activities with Palestinian resistance groups in Lebanon and Jordan, or had trained in Iraq or Egypt as part of these activities of the Syrian Ikhwan Muslimin. As the number of Egyptians grew within the ranks of the Arab Afghans, a significant number of former military men could be found, many of whom had been involved in the 1967 and 1973 wars. Right? Mustafa Hamid. Many Egyptians went to Afghanistan because of Israel, because of 1967's complete defeat. From the first seconds of the war to the last, and also from 1973's initial success and then defeat. For example, Muhammad al-Makawi, a prominent Afghan mujahid, famous for his criticisms of the Battle of Jalalabad, was in the Special Forces in the 1973 war. And among those on the front lines, he resigned from the army and when he got a chance, left for Afghanistan. Abu Hafs al-Masri, one of al-Qaeda's founders, also known as Muhammad Atta, the military commander of al-Qaeda later, was trained in missile use. Abu Jihad al-Masri from Tanim al-Jihad, also known as Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and later al-Qaeda, also served in the anti-aircraft missile section. Abu Abdul Rahman, a one-time al-Qaeda member and mujahid, respected for his proficiency with the BM weapon, from where he got his lifelong nickname, was in the chemical weapons section during the 1973 war. A good number of those who fought in these wars left to join the jihad in Afghanistan. Of course, there were others who did not have military backgrounds. Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri, one of the founders of al-Qaeda, was a police officer and also the original military commander of al-Qaeda. Even people not involved in military or police work were still motivated to join the jihad in Afghanistan because of the events of the 1967-1973 and the relationship between Egypt and Israel. Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri is going to have a prominent name in al-Qaeda only because of his training with earlier recruits. He's one of the earlier founders of al-Qaeda as well, from a training base called al-Masada, which was translated into the Lion's Den. Al-Masada was a very small camp in Afghanistan, in I want to say near the Paktia province or coast, and basically was situated ahead of a Russian military outpost, which was empty at the time. But then all of a sudden, they were invaded by approximately 200 Spetsnaz soldiers, which are special forces in Russia. And al-Masada held them off with just about 25, 30 men. They were outgunned, outmanned. And this actually became the big news with the Afghans, because here they have a bunch of Arabs, ragtag Arabs led by Osama bin Laden, who they were willing to take their money from, willing to use his father's construction company of the bin Laden Group, the Saudi bin Laden Group, to build ditches and build temporary offices at these outposts. And they defeated this group. And later, the word got out that bin Laden's Arabs were indeed valuable to the fight. The only good thing about the Arabs before that with the Afghans was that they were willing to die for the cause, in which they were. And so the name al-Qaeda, which is translated to the base, actually came from the base of al-Masada. It's not a computer database and all this conspiracy. It's just ridiculous. But that's where it came from. The idea of Al Qaeda came from the people of this base who fought against that conflict and won. And they were trained by a number of officers, including Abu Ubaid al-Banshiri and Abu Hafs al-Masri. And later, Abu Ubaid al-Banshiri and another person who's going to have a name much later was involved with the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993 at some extent, and most prominently the bombing of the embassies in 1998 in Tanzania and Somalia, is a man named Ali Muhammad, who basically was a military trainer here in the United States at Fort Bragg, and also had dual loyalty with Osama bin Laden and became an informant for the CIA and the FBI. In Syria, the failure of the Ikhwan Muslimin-led jihad against the al-Assad regime in the late 1970s, early 1980s, led some to look in Afghanistan. The jihad in Afghanistan offered safety from al-Assad's crackdown in Syria, as well as an outlet for those who wished to continue fighting and were angry at the corruption and mistakes of the jihad in their own country. Mustafa Hamid. Many Syrians from the earlier generations of Arab Afghans had been involved in the fight against the al-Assad regime. Depressed by the events in Syria and feeling betrayed by the Ikhwan Muslimin and his corruption, they went to Afghanistan, but largely kept to themselves. Some disappeared into the Afghan forefronts and just participated in the fighting. Nobody really knew where they were. A number of Yemenis who traveled to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets were also among the early generations of Afghan Arabs. At that time, Yemen was split into North and South Yemen, with South Yemen under the control of a communist regime with close ties to the Soviet Union. The two Yemeni states were often in conflict. And here's Mustafa Hamid's quote. In Yemen, there have been tensions between the North and South, and it was felt that the South was under the influence of the Russians. Some men wanted to go to Afghanistan to fight the Russians there, while others wanted to prepare for jihad in Yemen and to liberate the South from communist rule. This was one of the reasons Abu Abdallah, Osama bin Laden, went to Afghanistan, was because of Yemen. As you know, Yemen was even one of the reasons why Abu Abdallah established Al-Qaeda, but he did not announce it. He did not want to cause rivalry within Al-Qaeda because at that time, everyone was thinking about his own country. In fact, many Yemenis, especially those who came to fight in Afghanistan after the 1987 Battle of Jaji, which basically was the battle that I was talking about between the Soviets and the Arabs, were from the south of Yemen. They went to Afghanistan to see Abu Abdallah. Osama bin Laden also went by the name Abu Abdallah, just for people to understand. The occupation of Palestine also factored heavily into the motivations and activities of some from among the early generations who traveled to Afghanistan. The Israeli invasions of Lebanon in 1978 and 1982 also had a significant impact. Mustafa Hamid. In Egypt, it was the Israeli war in 1973 and Sadat's relations with Israel and the repression of the state. In Syria, it was the al-Assad regime. In Yemen, it was the communists to the south. Then, of course, there was the issue of the occupation of Palestine and the Israeli army's invasion of Lebanon in 1978, and later its expulsion of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was a very big insult to all the Arabs. Some early generation Arab Afghans either trained or joined with Palestinian resistance groups in Lebanon or Jordan. Mustafa Hamid was among those who traveled to participate in the Palestinian resistance in Lebanon. He and a friend sought to fight with the Fatah organization, which was the organization created by Abu Nidal. They were called Fatah organization, which was the main Palestinian fighting group and the only one at the time that had an Islamic faction inside its ranks, led by Abu Nidal. My friend, Mustafa Hamid. My friend and I went to Lebanon after Israel's 1978 invasion, which caused a strong reaction among the Arabs. We went by ourselves and fought and sought to find Fatah because we knew that since 1965, it had started to become a religious group. We were welcome to fight with them because at that time, there were only a few Egyptians volunteering for the jihad. I left Lebanon after the ceasefire when it became clear that there was no more fighting. Fatah had also put the religious elements in one group and sent them near to the communist elements from another resistance group. And I feared Fatah was playing a bad game, that the outcome would be fighting between the Palestinians. And it did, because it caused dissension between Fatah and the Palestinian Liberalization Organization led by Yasser Arafat. In fact, Arafat would later say that Fatah was an Israeli creation because Abu Nidal actually was a secret operative for Israel and many other countries' governments like Iraq and Germany and others. This would actually play into my theory with the al-Jarrah family, because Ziad Jarrah, who is the alleged pilot hijacker of Flight 93 that crashed in Pennsylvania, had family that were involved with the PLO, including a cousin named Hassan al-Jarrah, who basically was a Israeli, Germany, and PLO operative. Interestingly enough, his cousin, Ali al-Jarrah, was also a Hezbollah operative, but he was a secret agent for Israel for 25 years. I'm not saying that Ziad Jarrah was an Israeli operative. It's a theory. I have no evidence for it. So please take that with a grain of salt, but it's a theory of mine that in order for the planes operation, the 9/11 attack to be successful, they needed an operative inside the group itself that's heading the operation. And what better way to have a guy with no religious fundamentalist background whatsoever to basically come to Germany and meet with the people who would go on to hijack all the planes involved with the 9/11 operation in Ziad Jarrah, right? So we won't talk about that now. I mean, I have many videos about this, including a podcast episode dedicated to this. Please listen to that. It's about the background of Ziad Jarrah. Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian who would go on to be among the most famous of the Arab Afghans trained with Fatah in Jordan. Mustafa Hamid. Abdul Aziz Ali, who from the Egyptian Ikhwan Muslimin, trained Abdullah Azzam in Jordan. Abdul Aziz Ali was a mujahideen in the 1948 war in Palestine and later traveled to Afghanistan and played an important role. Leah Farrall. Was Azzam with Fatah at the time or Ikhwan Muslimin? Mustafa Hamid. Fatah had made a faction inside its organization for Ikhwan Muslimin people. Abdul Aziz Ali came to train the Ikhwan Muslimin faction. When these early generation volunteers went to Afghanistan, there was no Arab media campaign in support of the jihad. There was none until later. It was created by Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, and one of its earlier media employees was none other than goodness gracious. My mind is shot. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Woo! I'm going to leave that in there just so you know I'm not as flawless as you think I am. I'm also 54 years old, so I have the pleasure of using my age as a way. Oh boy. Yeah, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He actually worked under Abdul Rasul Sayyaf and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. But he worked in the media committee led by Abdul Rasul Sayyaf. Just to let you know that, hey, there's a beginning, a branch out effect here later on. As Wael Juladeen, now there's another name who basically was one of the founding members of Al Qaeda and later was one of the co-signers of the office ahead of a Brooklyn mosque of the called Al Farouk, which was located in Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn. The Al-Kifa Refugee Center. The Al-Kifa Refugee Center was the first actual office that had a connection to the Maktab al-Khidmat, the Afghan Services Office, which actually was getting donations from the Saudi government and indirectly from the CIA's Operation Cyclone program, which was going through Pakistan at the time because the Arabs didn't want non-government organizations to basically be seen as the forefront of the war because they wanted to be seen as an Arab war, an Islamic war, not a U.S. war. They'll take their money, but they won't recognize where it came from, in other words. So Wael Juladeen, along with 3 others, under the direction of Osama bin Laden, helped create the Al-Kifa Refugee Center, which basically began the donation and recruitment drive of Arabs from New York and elsewhere to Afghanistan, to Pakistan, to Afghanistan. As Wael Juladeen, an earlier generation Arab-Afghan, reminisced, he first heard about the jihad in Afghanistan through Western media, or from the mouths of enemies, as he put it, before he heard it from friends and supporters. Okay, that's the end of that subsection of the chapter. And I'm going to be doing this from time to time. This is a very important book. It's one of the most primary sources of learning, in my opinion, regarding my study into Al Qaeda's history and the Afghan Soviet War and the rise of Arab militias in Afghanistan, which were indirectly supported by the CIA, the Pakistani government, its intelligence services, the ISI, the Saudi government, and its intelligence services, the Mahabeth. And they all will later on have an effect as to how Al Qaeda was created and how other groups were given rise and created, like Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, Jemaah Islamiyah in Indonesia, and of course, Gamma Islamiyah and the Egyptian Islamic Jihad in Egypt. And this would later have a resounding effect and historical effect that led to terrorist attacks in New York in 1993 and, of course, in 2001. And so thank you for staying with me and joining and having an interest in this. And see you in the next chapter. Goodbye, everybody.